there's cat hair. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. My name's Molly, I'm the maker behind Lefty Knits, and this channel is a place where I share all the nitty crafty things that I've been up to recently. Today, I want to share with you some tips for yarn substitution that I've picked up over the years of knitting, of making projects that didn't work out exactly the way I was intending. And while I do that, I'm going to work on, that's the back, this sweater. So this is my Quill Tee by Tiff Nealon. I've been talking about it quite a bit in my last couple videos. Maybe only my last video, but it is a top-down colorwork raglan sweater. This is the back. I keep showing you. This is the front. And I'm almost done. I did the sleeves. I was doing some helical knitting. I made a short talking about how I've been doing that. I only have one ball left, this much, and I am on the very end. So I'm finishing up the bottom ribbing. This is knit in the Yarn Collective Floorville 4-ply in the colorway Hibiscus, and the colorwork is done in Stroll Bear from Knit Picks, Bear Stroll. I've talked about this before, so I'll link that. I also talked in the same video about what I'm wearing today, which is my Current Mood shawl by Leslie Ann Robinson of Knit Graffiti. I used Malabrigo Machita in Three Little Pigs, Aurora, and Swamp. So again, I'll link this pattern down below, and I'll link my video down below and up above me where I talk about this and this pattern. Today, while I finish up the ribbing on this and hopefully get ready to do my bind off, I'm gonna do a sewn bind off on this, even though I think the pattern just calls for typical bind off, but I did a sewn Italian bind off. I did an Italian bind off on these sleeves. I don't know how well you can tell. And I'd like to do that as well for the body, so I'm not going to be doing that while we talk. I'll just be finishing up the knitting. I want to talk today about the way that I tend to go about selecting yarn for patterns. I rarely use the selected yarn when I'm working on a pattern. I have spent my whole adult life in academia. I don't yet have a particularly lucrative career, so I'm often looking at more mid-range yarn. I'm looking more at things like Knit Picks, Valley yarns, Plymouth yarns from Webs or yarn.com. Malabrigo kind of fits into that, where I would say it's maybe a little more expensive than the others, but it does give you that variegated effect that a lot of the hand-dyed yarn does give. That's often kind of more the type of yarn that I'm working with, which I think if you've been watching my channel for a while, you probably noticed. I also tend to rely a lot on yarn sales, on closeout yarns, so unfortunately a lot of the yarns that you do see me work with are discontinued, especially if they're maybe more luxury blend. But I definitely have used yarn at all ends of the price spectrum. I have bought a good amount of hand-dyed yarn over the years. I tend to buy it, you know, in smaller quantities, 1 to 2 skeins maybe at a time. And I do enjoy working with it. I definitely invest in yarn in a way that, you know, a lot of people maybe don't. I would say I'm probably somewhere in the middle in the grand scheme of things. I'm not like trying to sit here saying that I'm not spending money on yarn, because I definitely am. It's very important to me. It's something that I prioritize because knitting is something I really enjoy and something that I find to be good for my mental health, just something that I like to do and that I want to prioritize doing in my life. These are just generally the most important things I look for myself, and the order that you look at these things, etc., will definitely vary a lot depending on the project. Before I get into it, I want to say I would be really excited to hear how you go about approaching yarn substitution. Is there anything that you look for that I am not mentioning? Do you think that there's a particular order that's really important for you to look for things? Just please leave me a comment and I'd love to chat about this, because as I learn more about yarn, the way that ply can affect things, the way that different fibers behave, as I've done a little bit of spinning myself, it's definitely more interesting to me to think about how choosing different yarns can affect the finished product, how that might happen in ways that you don't or didn't expect in certain projects. Just any sort of info that you have, insight you have about yarn substitution, I'd love to hear it. Please leave me a comment below. Let's chat. So the first thing I think you should consider before you look at anything else, probably, at least if you have one, is budget. With few exceptions, sometimes very niche yarn can be hard to replicate, but with very few exceptions, I think you will be able to find a yarn that behaves well and gives you the effect you're looking for at almost any price point. And I think that being really honest about what you're willing to spend on this quantity of yarn before you get started is gonna be beneficial to you. Getting a handle on that early can help you focus on the yarns that are actually going to be options for you, I think. So, for example, if you're looking online, you can sort price from lowest to highest, or filter out yarns that are over a certain price. Knowing what you're willing to spend can help you really focus in on yarns that will be what you're looking for. It can kind of help you mitigate some of the potential tyranny of choice or decision paralysis you might get from having too many options. Even though it might feel limiting sometimes, it can just be better to cut out the noise by getting a handle on your budget and sticking to yarns that very strictly fit within that budget. The second thing I would recommend thinking about is yarn weight. And I mean that a little bit more holistically than just looking at a yarn and saying, look, that yarn's DK, this yarn is DK, it should work. Because there can be an incredible amount of variation between yarns that are in the same category. Some of it is definitely related to the fiber type, for sure. Certain fiber types are heavier than others, so you'll get less yardage per gram, even if the yarn is a similar thickness, but it's not always something like that. Sometimes a yarn just is thinner, and it kind of falls on one end of the boundary for yarn weight. So when I'm deciding what yarn to use for a project, I tend to try to match the yardage per hank or the yardage per gram as closely as possible, especially if I want it to look like the pattern photo and if this isn't something that's meant to be knit at a very open gauge. For example, like if you're knitting a fingering weight garment at like 18 stitches per inch, that's much more open. You can kind of make some different calculations, but I'll talk about situations like that a little bit later. Assuming it's a worsted weight garment, for example, that has a gauge of 18 to 20-ish stitches per inch, I'll try to match my yarn weight per gram pretty closely. So this depends a lot on how thick the yarn is. It can take some trial and error. I would say generally I'm probably trying to keep it within about 30 yards per 100 gram hank of difference. So if you're looking at a 200 yard hank, for example, I would be looking for something between 170 and 230. Although in that case, I might close those boundaries a little bit. For something like a fingering weight yarn, each yard weighs less and is a smaller percentage of the overall hank. So I would say generally as the weight, the bulkiness of the yarn increases, I try to have it be closer and closer to the same weight per gram, if that makes sense. Also, sometimes different sources can have a yarn weight listed differently. So the example that I'll talk about is my use of Mrs. Crosby hat box, which is a yarn I talked about recently wanting to use in a muscle burrow. I ended up using it initially in a dark water by Jennifer Steingass, and it is when I bought it, according to Webs or yarn.com, it was a DK weight yarn, but when I bought it, I hadn't done as much garment knitting as I do now, and seeing a DK weight yarn that's 317 yards per gram, that's a typical plied yarn, that's a light DK to me now. I'm like, oh, that's pretty light. But when I bought it, I just was thinking that it was maybe a little bit more of a typical DK. In fact, Ravelry has a hat box listed as a sport weight yarn. So, like I said, different sources can have weights listed a little bit differently. And it can be helpful if you're looking at something that's a little bit on the edge there, or just in general looking at a couple sources about weight. My initial plan with the hat box was to make the Alaska sweater by Camille Descoteaux, and the suggested yarn for that is Knit Picks City Tweed DK, which is for 100 grams of that yarn, it comes in 50-gram skeins. But if you're looking at 100 grams of that yarn, it's 246 yards versus 317 yards of hat box per 100 grams. So that's a pretty sizable difference. And when I was swatching, I think I only did like small swatches. I didn't take off my needles. I wouldn't recommend that, but I was getting closer to something like 24 stitches per inch, and I just was getting worried that the gauge wasn't really going to match. The gauge of the Alaska sweater is 22 stitches per 4 inches, and the pattern that I ended up choosing, the dark water, actually also has a gauge of 22 stitches per 4 inches. But when I looked at Ravelry project pages, other people had some tighter gauges for the dark water. It is technically a fingering weight pattern, so that's a slightly loose gauge, I would say, for a fingering weight garment, especially probably a colorwork one. So as I kind of did more research and thought about it more, that yarn felt more appropriate for that project. So that's a case where I kind of bought a yarn without really thinking through the weight in a serious way, and it ended up working out fine, but it ended up coming back to bite me in terms of the original project because it just wasn't actually particularly appropriate yarn for the project that I was thinking of. Next, and I feel like this one and the one before are extremely important to kind of think of in tandem, but you really need to consider fiber type when you're looking at different yarns. It can really have a pretty dramatic effect on the way that your final garment ends up looking. So something like wool is a very common choice. It has a good amount of elasticity. It'll spring back into its original shape pretty well. Like, it can stretch out, but it will kind of like come back to shape when you wash it. Something like silk, alpaca, cotton, those fibers don't have that same kind of elasticity or the same memory is what a lot of people talk about it as. So those fibers are more likely to stretch out, lose their shape, and stay that way than a wool yarn. At the same time, of course, different fibers have different levels of warmth. Like alpaca, for example, is a very warm yarn. Wool is, I suppose, on the warm side as well. Cotton, much more appropriate for a summery tank if you live somewhere with a very hot summer climate. Now, yarn blends are pretty common. The way in which the yarns adopt properties of each fiber in them can depend on the way that they're spun, which I'll talk about later, the quantities of them, what else is mixed in, if there's nylon or acrylic, if there's a different animal fiber or plant fiber added to one or the other. It can be just definitely a different calculation. But if you want something that looks similar to the pattern photos, you probably want to find a yarn that has a similar fiber content. Now, not all wool is the same. There's lots of different sheep breeds that have different properties to the wool that they produce. There's lots of websites that you can look at that will show you different staple lengths, kind of what the raw wool off of each of these different sheep will look like. That can be really informative, but at a more basic level, I guess, things like whether a yarn is superwash or not will have a dramatic effect on the finished garment. Superwash yarns have treated fibers that are coated so that they don't felt when you agitate them by doing something like putting them in the washing machine. And they have a different feel to them. Like if you run your hand over them versus a non-superwash wool, they will feel different. Superwash yarn can kind of feel softer in a hank. It has a little bit more of like a smoothness or a shininess to it a lot of times. Superwash yarn often ends up having a little bit more drape. It has less structure, so a finished product with a superwash yarn will be more like floppy than a non-superwash yarn. Like if you make a hat and you hold it up and you're just holding it up like this in front of the camera, you're more likely to get droop with a superwash yarn than you are with a non-superwash yarn. I also tend to find that superwash yarns grow a lot more with blocking, which is something that makes swatching a little bit more important, in my opinion. Superwash yarn tends to take dye more readily. You can get more vibrant colors out of superwash yarn. So it's often used by indie dyers who are trying to make these very bold, speckly colorways because it's just a lot easier and more possible with a superwash yarn than it is with a non-superwash yarn. It's definitely possible to substitute a cotton yarn for a wool one in a pattern, alpaca for wool, whatever, to add different blends to your project or use different blends for your project. But it's very important to know how it will affect your finished product when you're done, because it will just make sure that you're getting what you actually want in your finished product. Now, I talked about this a little bit, but my next point will be that you want to think about the yarn texture, the way the yarn is constructed and plied, because that can really change how your yarn behaves, even if you're looking at the same fiber content. The way yarn is traditionally made, you are essentially taking, I actually have my drop spindle right here, I'll take it out, but you're essentially taking this wool, some raw wool, and you are twisting it adding twist to the yarn or to the fiber to make yarn, and that creates a stronger fiber than the unspun wool. Typically what you do once you have, you know, a couple hundred yards of this or however much you want, is you take one of these, you twist it with other strands of singles, which is what one of these strands is. So in applied yarn, you're looking at having multiple strands of the individual fiber that has been twisted again together. And all of that additional twist to those additional fibers can make the yarn more durable, less susceptible to pilling, and more round. So it's often good for something like cabling. So a single ply yarn, thus, is a little bit more prone to pilling. It's not necessarily quite as strong. It's not as even as a yarn that has been plied together. It might not be as good of a choice for something like a hard-wearing sweater, especially if held single, because you will get more pilling than if you're looking at something that is knit in a 4-ply yarn, for example. It's definitely not to say that you can't use them for sweaters. People do. Often it will be better if you are using them held with a mohair or something else, because that will add a little bit of strength and increase the durability. But on the whole, a single ply fiber will behave differently, and it might, for example, block differently than a yarn that has multiple plies. There are also other ways of creating yarn. So there's things like chainette yarns and blown yarns. With a blown yarn, you have a fiber that is literally being blown into a mesh tube. Like, you have this tube and you are essentially inserting fibers. A lot of times it'll be like a nylon tube and you're blowing in cotton, alpaca, wool into this tube. The tube can be a natural fiber as well, though. This is a type of yarn where you might end up getting into a little bit of trouble if you're going by the yardage per gram, because you'll have a much higher yardage when you don't have this dense fiber, because in this blown yarn there's a lot of space between the fibers. They're not twisted tightly together. They're kind of blown into this airy tube. So a chainette yarn or a chained yarn is sort of similar in that it's a lot airier and lighter. Often it's made by taking a plied yarn. Typically it'll be something that has multiple plies, and then you're doing something that isn't twisting them together. So sometimes a chainette yarn might be braided. A lot of times they are like little I-cords created out of these fibers, and they're also thus a little bit hollow. You know, like if you make an I-cord, there's like a little bit of a hole inside, and that can give it a good amount of stretch. So these are both yarns where you might find the finished product to be lighter. You might find a different yardage per gram than if you're looking at applied yarn. And searching these yarns can help you figure out what type of yarn something is if you're not sure. The more pictures you see, the more you knit, the easier it is to identify these kind of more, they're not even that obscure. There's some pretty popular like drops yarns that are blown yarns, for example. I've never worked with them. I use Knit Pick's Snuggle Puff, which is a blown cotton and nylon, I believe, yarn. So because the yarn texture or the plying method can affect the finished garment a lot, it can be helpful to look at the yarn that's recommended in the pattern, get a sense for how many plies the yarn has, what is it superwash yarn or not, is it a blown yarn instead, and knowing what the construction of the yarn itself is can help you pick something that will give you a similar vibe to the pattern photos, or not if that's not what you're looking for. Next, it's important to consider how much it matters to the finished product what the yarn type is like. I'll explain that a little more. If you're knitting a garment like a sweater versus a shawl, the type of yarn you use can matter a little bit more for a sweater, because ultimately what you want is for a sweater to fit someone, and you want it to stay fitting someone. You want it to not just totally lose its shape. You don't want a sock to totally stretch out and stop fitting someone, so that's why you might want to use something that's like a wool nylon blend for a sock. If you're, for example, knitting a complicated cable pattern, a textured pattern, and you really want your stitches to pop, you probably want to use a very round yarn. You probably want something that has multiple plies versus a single ply yarn. On the other hand, if you're knitting a shawl with a very simple pattern, the differences in the yarn between what you choose and what the pattern calls for will definitely affect the finished product, but it's not going to have the same consequences, because a shawl is something that you just drape over yourself. It's not something that you need to fit you very specifically in a certain way. An example of this comes from my current whips. So I'm making the Sunday morning wrap by Espace Tricot. I am using a 100% alpaca yarn for that. The recommended yarn is a discontinued DK weight non-superwash wool yarn from Espace Tricot. That will behave pretty differently. A wool yarn, as we've talked about, has more of this memory and elasticity. An alpaca yarn has more drape. It's more likely to kind of stretch out and be a little floppier, I guess, for lack of a better word. Ultimately, what most people are looking for in a shawl, and what I'm looking for in this shawl, is for it to be warm, to sort of drape kind of nicely over my body, and to be soft. And those are all qualities that you tend to find in alpaca yarn. So even though it's not the same as the yarn called for in the pattern pretty much at all, it should work pretty well, because what I'm looking for in my finished product isn't as specific to the properties of the yarn. So the last thing I want to talk about is that your personal preference can matter a lot. Different people have different preferences for how a garment will fit, and they'll have different, requirements for a yarn. Like if somebody wants to shop vegan, they'll be looking at cotton yarns, linen yarns, maybe with some synthetic fibers to help with things like elasticity. Some patterns too are written to have a very specific kind of fit. So they'll be written at a purposefully loose gauge so the stitches are more open and the fiber behaves in a certain way. An example of this would be the Rift. That's a pretty popular pattern, and it's written for sport weight yarn. I believe it's like a merino cotton linen blend yarn that's a sport weight, but the suggested gauge is 16 stitches per 4 inches. So that is very loose for a sport weight yarn. And a lot of people have knitted with a DK, a worsted, an Aran weight yarn, and it's turned out well. It doesn't have the exact same type of fit as the pattern photos necessarily. The finished fabric will be a little bit denser and thicker, but it's not necessarily wrong to knit it that way. That's up to your own desires and how you want the pattern to fit. You definitely don't always have to go with a yarn that is similar to the one that's in the pattern, but it can be helpful to consider if you want to use something different, how you want it to be different. Like what's your goal in looking for a different kind of yarn? It's often generally about just knowing what you want and being able to look at the pattern yarn that was used, and if you want a different vibe, to make educated choices to get the vibe that you're looking for. Something that I will do a lot is look at the yarns that other people have used on Ravelry. If I'm trying to, pick yarn for a project, what yarns have people used? Which of those yarns are ones that are accessible to me? I know that unfortunately Ravelry is not an accessible website to everyone. You could do something similar to this by looking at the hashtag for a pattern that you're interested in and see what people who've posted on Instagram have used to knit up that pattern. It can be really helpful to see photos of a project that aren't designer photos. Test photos, of course, are helpful, but non-test photos can be even more helpful because people might be thinking even more outside the box at what sort of combinations they can use if they're not trying to, specifically test the pattern as written. It can also be a huge source of inspiration to think outside the box. So maybe you thought you wanted it to look one way, but you see, oh, these other people are doing this and this and this, and maybe I want to try that too. So that's all I have for you today. Let me show you how far I got on this knitting. Now, I definitely was not lighting up the knitting. I was getting distracted, as you may have noticed, so I wasn't necessarily as committed to the knitting as I might have been. As I was thinking and gesturing with my hands, which I do enjoy doing a lot when I talk. So I didn't knit that much. I knit this many rows, but I'm getting there. That was helpful for me to get closer. I'm definitely not an expert in substituting yarns. I'm just someone who likes knitting, who knits on a tighter budget maybe than some designers are knitting on themselves. And I've found that certain yarns, certain tactics for substituting yarns work better than others. I've definitely had my fair share of yarn substitution based heartbreak and frustration, and I've done lots of frogging. So I think that I have some ideas that have helped me become a lot more successful. The one thing I didn't say that I'm going to, or I didn't say outright, I kind of mentioned in the intro, but I want to make sure to mention again, is that swatching, making a pretty, 4x4 inch-ish, 10x10 centimeter swatch and blocking it and waiting for it to be dry can be a huge game changer, because, as I said, certain yarns, superwash yarns, silk, cotton, alpaca, things like that can tend to really grow when you block them. So knowing how it's going to be after you block versus before you block can also save you a lot of heartache. As I said up top, I would love to hear your techniques, any insights you have into how to substitute. If you want a different vibe from the pattern photo, how do you go about achieving that? What makes you think that you should try a very different yarn from a pattern photo, and how do you know that it's going to turn out how you want? I just think as I've gotten more into spinning, as I've learned more about yarn, I've found this topic to be more and more interesting, and I just really like to hear other people's takes on it. I'll also link some resources, some sites that I have looked at in the past to learn more about different fibers, fiber properties, so that if you want to dig a little deeper, you can look at those as well. If you'd enjoy this video, I would really appreciate you giving it a like and consider subscribing to this channel. I make videos every week about knitty things, often more podcasty, but sometimes a little bit more informational, I guess, like today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I'll see you in the next one, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.